All right, let's grab our Bibles tonight. If you would, please turn to the book of Esther, chapter number 2. And we're going to take a different kind of a look tonight. And some of you, I think probably most, are going to look at the book of Esther from a totally different vantage point after the message tonight. I think we got a totally different slant than I think most people approach this with. And I think tonight you're going to have a greater appreciation for the Lord, and you're going to see Him in this book, even though His name does not appear anywhere in it. Instead of reading through the verses, we're going to be covering all of the verses tonight, most of them anyway, and so we'll read it as we approach it. I want to bring a message tonight on the subject, the making of something great. One thing that I think that everybody here has in common with one another is that we all like food. All of us. Now there's differences in people's tastes. Some like Chinese food, some like Mexican. Some prefer hamburgers or hot dogs or French fries or Wendy's chili or Oreos or Krispy Kremes. But we all like food. But while we have perhaps been locked in on a favorite food, have you ever wondered what they put into it that makes it taste so good? You like Twinkies? They put beef fat in it to make it yummy. Do you love cheese as much as I love cheese? Did you know that they use cow stomachs to make it? It's called rennet. And it's an enzyme that comes from the fourth stomach of a baby calf. It's used to curdle the cheese. You like chewing gum? It contains sorbitol, which is actually a laxative when used in larger quantities. And it also contains lanolin, which is oil found in wool produced by sheep. If you like Mountain Dew or Dr. Pepper or any other soft drink, they're made with phosphoric acid, which is used as a rust remover. You like Jell-O? I like Jell-O. It's made with gelatin. But how many people know that gelatin is 50% boiled pig skin and 25% cow bones? You ever seen candy that's nice and shiny or pills that are real slick to help them go down? Or maybe those shiny apples in the store? The shiny coating is made from secretions of insects and is also used to make shellac found in fingernail polish. You like chicken noodle soup? Johns Hopkins did a study on the ingredients and discovered that the chicken used in chicken noodle soup is a rather inferior grade of chicken. And they came up with a long list of ingredients that include, this is in your chicken noodle soup, antidepressants, arsenic, and a long list of some over-the-counter drugs. Do you like high-fiber foods? After all, they say that fiber is good for you, right? Did you know that high-fiber foods, a lot of them contain cellulose? It's in salad dressings, cereals, shredded cheese. Well, preacher, what's wrong with that? Cellulose is made from wood pulp. It has no calories. It's nice and filling. So the next time that you're chewing on a fiber bar, it might taste a little bit like sawdust. Now, if all of that bothers you, let me give you some good news that you're going to find in this chapter tonight. Prozac and chicken noodle soup might not be your favorite, nor are the wood chips in your cereal. But the truth is, the makers of those products just might have gotten some of these ideas from God, because He too uses some very strange ingredients when it comes to coming up with something really good. Let's take a look at verse number 1 here. As we come to the word servants in verse 2, you may want to circle that word. And we're going to take a look tonight at some very strange things that God was kind of putting into this goulash stew that he's making. And out of this thing, he's going to come up with a marvelous, wonderful miracle. The first ingredient that God uses down here all the time is politics. Verse 1, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women under the custody of Hegi the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women. And let their findings for purification be given them, and let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Unfortunately, politics have been around for a long, long time, and guess what? Even the Antichrist is going to be a politician. What we find in this passage is a group of people known as the king's servants, who were not interested at all with the idea of helping the king. They were just wanting to make sure that Vashti did not come back as the queen. It's been 4 years now since Vashti was removed. She had been commanded by the king to parade herself in front of hundreds and hundreds of drunken officials. She refused to do so. He was talked into removing her by the king's servants. And after having gotten rid of her, now they're hearing the king say, boy, I sure do miss that woman. She was so good to me. I really loved Vashti. And when they heard that kind of talk, it bothered them tremendously. They were the ones that had gotten rid of her. They were not interested in seeing her come back. And the reason was because of this thing called a woman's wrath. If she was brought back to the throne and allowed to be queen, these individuals could very easily be put to death. And therefore, they had to come up with another plan. And this other plan was going to not benefit the king. This other plan was going to benefit them. Is that not what politicians do? They get our vote. They go to Washington. And then they make decisions that's going to benefit them instead of us. Have you ever wondered why they have such a great medical program and insurance for themselves, and they can't come up with any kind of a solution to help the American people? The reason is because politicians don't care about the people who put them there. They only care about themselves. And these politicians were individuals that were worried about what would happen if Vashti was allowed to come back, because she was going to hurt them. And they knew that. Politicians, the matter of politics, it's enough to make you sick. And yet God is willing to reach down into this filthy world and grab hold of a great big old handful of politics to create something that is astounding and marvelous. Verse number 5. Circle the two names as we come to them, Mordecai and Esther. And the second thing tonight that God is willing to use down here and pulling it out of this muddy mess is his remnant. Verse 5 says, now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Notice the lineage. God's spending a lot of time here letting us know the Jewish lineage of Mordecai. Verse 6, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, meaning his cousin. For she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Here we find something that really should not be a surprise to us at all. And that is the fact that God will always, always have a remnant. A group of His people. They might be buried in the world. They might be buried kind of deep. But God will always have His remnant. But the strange thing is not that it exists. The strange thing is that God is creating something special. And He has just taken a big old scoop of the local politics, and now He's mingling His people with it, found in Mordecai and Esther, both of whom in this passage are identified as Jews. Now, Mordecai and Esther, they were living in Persia, the reason being that God had proclaimed a 70-year captivity as punishment for His people. They would not obey Him. They wouldn't listen to Him. And so God sent Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon to come into Jerusalem, to smash it, to destroy it, to wipe out the temple, and then to take so many of these individuals into captivity. And they were locked up there for 70 years. And then God allowed the Babylonians to be defeated and conquered by the Persians. And under the Persians, boy, the Jews were able to prosper. They were treated like human beings. The slavery was over, and Cyrus even allowed some of these individuals to go back to Jerusalem, and about 50,000 of God's remnant decided to go back. Under Persian rule, life for the Jew had become good. I can remember when I first got saved, I was so amazed as a brand new Christian getting into a Baptist church. I was so amazed at how many people there were who were just like me. Saved, baptized, learning the same things that I was learning about. They were reading their Bibles pretty much on a daily basis. They were spending time in prayer. Everything that I was doing and was enjoying and was brand new to me, they had been doing, some of them for years. And there was such a common point among us. And after I got saved, I started going to work looking. What was I looking for? People just like me. I mean, if I had gotten saved, I wonder if there's anybody else in this heathen squadron who's also saved. And the more I started looking, the more I started finding people going to church. And when we got off kind of by ourselves and nobody was around to hear us, this individual was now willing to talk about the Lord, inviting me to some Catholic, charismatic outing that they were going to. And the longer that I was saved, the more I discovered there were other people around me, and they'd been around me all the time. And now I was finding out that they were saved. And that was kind of a weird feeling to me, because when I first got saved, and I was already looking at all these other people that I'd known for a couple of years, when I first got saved, I kind of felt like Elijah. I'm the only one. My commanding officer, forget it. He divorced his wife because she was one of them born-again Christians. My executive officer, forget it. My superior officers? No. Fellow pilots? Not even close. And I honestly felt like I'm the only one. But then over a period of time, I started to realize what's being presented right here, and that is, they might not always be easy to find, but God always has a remnant. Always. Verse number 8. The third thing that God is going to reach down and grab a hold of, and this is something that I think it bothers us. Because there's some bad things going on in this world. And God is willing to use some of these bad things, and sometimes people look at this like, whoa, why would God be endorsing something like that? The Bible is recording the fact that God used it, not that He endorsed it. Verse number 8, third thing is this: there were customs that are pathetic. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought in also unto the king's house, to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. Now again, before we get into this next issue, I want to remind you something about the Bible. It records things that took place, but just because it records it in the Bible does not mean that God was in favor of it. Slavery is one of those issues. Slavery is found throughout the Bible. But you don't find any verses that come out and say that slavery was wrong. God was not endorsing slavery. He was not desiring it. He's simply taking something that was already in place, and He's telling people how to deal with it if you happen to be the slave. Or He's telling people how to deal with it if they happen to be the master. He's not endorsing it. Doesn't like it. He's simply showing His people how to deal with it. If you were to look at Daniel's life in Babylon as a teenage slave, it was brutal. Daniel and his 3 friends went through some tough times in Babylon, in slavery. His 3 friends were thrown into a fiery furnace simply because they refused to bow down to an idol. The Babylonians were eventually conquered by the Persians, and it was at the end of those 70 years that thousands of Jews were allowed to go back home to Israel if they wanted to. Some chose to remain. In fact, a lot of them chose to remain in Persia. But even though life in Persia was now a whole lot better than it used to be, it still had its problems. And one of those problems that existed under this king, Xerxes, in the land of Persia, was this thing called a harem. As a girl was reaching adulthood, she would naturally want to get married. She wanted to fall in love, to get married, to have children, to have a family, and to grow old married to somebody that you loved and cherished. But for beautiful young women living in countries that were ruled by this kind of a king, those young women lived under a cloud of what if? What if one of the king's representatives spotted her? What if her youth and beauty came to be noticed by the king? What if somebody showed up at the door and decided that she was going to be now placed in the harem of the king? What if she was ripped out of the arms of her parents? What if she was taken to the palace to be placed in a harem, sometimes hundreds of women existing in this type of lifestyle? She would never be able to marry a person that she loved. She would never have the life that she had always dreamed of. Instead, she would be taken, thrown into the palace, groomed and prepared for a one-night honeymoon. And after that one night was over, then she'd be placed in the girls' dormitory with all of the other concubines. The king probably, months later, not even remembering her name, not knowing if she would ever see the king again. And there she would spend the rest of her life locked up as a concubine. The word gathered in this verse means to be taken up, to be collected, to grasp, to grab hold of. And it reveals the very harsh reality of those times when the king's servants were constantly searching the entire kingdom to find the next person who was to be robbed of her purity, robbed of her family, and of her future. That's not what God established. That's not what God set up. That's not what God wanted. But you know what God did? God decided to use it. And so he took some lying, cheating politicians. And he grabbed up a whole bunch of filthy, evil, wicked customs. And he looked at this mess that was down here. And there in the midst of it was God's remnant. And God said, you know what? I think I can make up something good out of this mess. Verse number 9. The fourth ingredient tonight, God chose to use helpers in unusual places. And verse 9 says, and the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her, out of the king's house. And he preferred her, circle the word preferred, and he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. As Esther was taken to become one of the many concubines of the king, God brought about something that was very similar to what happened to Daniel years before in Babylon. God allowed an insider to not only notice Esther, but this man decided to treat her with kindness and with favor. Haggai was his name, and God used him to prepare Esther for the day when she would be brought before the king. And keep this in mind. This man that God chose to use was not a Jew. He was not a believer. He was a lost person who happened to have a good heart. And God used this man to be a help and an encouragement to Esther. One of the people that God used in my life to bring me to the place where I could one day get saved, to another day when I would eventually be called to preach, was a woman by the name of Iris Hoop. She was an older Methodist woman. She was a widow. And of all places, the Methodist pastor put this woman in charge of a young couples class to teach. She was old. I don't know, maybe 65, something like that. I don't know. I thought she was maybe in her 70s. I was in my 20s. We had nothing in common. I wanted to talk about flying and sports. She probably wanted to talk about a heating pad and Bengay. I don't know. We had nothing in common. And yet God used this widow to open my eyes spiritually and to help me to see just how lost I was. She was the one who started passing Baptist preaching tapes to me. I'd come to church on Sunday, go to her Sunday school class, and she would slip me quietly a Baptist preacher. I'd never heard of Jack Van Impe, but she had me listening to Jack Van Impe preaching sermons. I was listening to Southern Baptist preachers. And I was listening to all this Baptist preaching, and they kept talking about being saved and being born again. I'd never heard that stuff. And God used this woman to begin a spiritual transformation in my life. But capture this. I grew up in a Methodist church. Not one Methodist pastor had any impact in my life. No Sunday school teacher ever had an impact when I was growing up. But when I was a Navy pilot, Jacksonville, Florida, Methodist church, here's an older woman. Looking back, I truly believe that she was saved. And she's helping me to see things that I'd never seen before. Because of that woman. She didn't witness to me. She didn't tell me how to be saved. But she exposed me to the Bible, to Bible preaching. And I ended up getting saved, getting into a Baptist church, called to preach, and I'm in Kokomo tonight pastoring this church because of Iris Hoop. How does that work? You ready for this? God. God doesn't have to use Baptists only. God doesn't have to use men preachers only. God can use widows in a liberal denomination, may not even know how to witness to anybody, but what little she did, boy, God sure did use it. And God uses the most unlikely people to bring about His will. And God sure does know how to make some great things. Verse number 10. A fifth ingredient tonight that God used to put together and make something that was downright wonderful, miraculous. Ingredient number 5 is compromise. Verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Well, what is this talking about? It's talking about Esther had never revealed to anybody the fact that she was a Jew. Nobody knew. It was a secret. And this is the part that I think will cause a lot of us tonight to look at the book of Esther in a totally different fashion. Because you know what? Most people think of Esther as a hero. Most people think of Mordecai as a hero. And the truth of the matter is, they were compromisers. Esther and Mordecai were nothing like Daniel and his 3 friends. Not even close. When Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon, they requested immediately, they requested to be fed a Jewish diet. They were willing to go on record putting God to the test. Either he can take care of us or he can't. But here we find Esther and her cousin Mordecai living in Persia all of their lives. They're adults. They've been raised in Persia. And nobody knows that they're Jewish. Not even their fellow Jews. Nobody. How did that come about? What about their Jewish diet? Surely their Jewish diet would have kind of given them away. I guess that means that they were not observing a Jewish diet. What about observing the Sabbath? I mean, it was the violation of the Sabbath that brought about the captivity to begin with. Surely, whenever they were observing the Sabbath, everybody around them could tell, oh, they must be Jewish because look, they're observing the Sabbath. Nobody knew because they were not observing the Sabbath. Well, what about their prayer lives? Daniel prayed 3 times every day. Went into his house, opened up the windows, prayed toward Jerusalem 3 times every day. And you know what? All of his enemies knew it. That's how he ended up in the lion's den. His enemies knew he was so predictable when it came to his prayer life. They set a trap for him. Tricked the king into making this decree that anybody prays to anybody in a period of 30 days, they go to the lion's den. They knew what Daniel would do. So how come Mordecai and Esther were not known to be Jewish because of their prayer lives? That's where it becomes a little bit discouraging. Because here Mordecai is at least a middle-aged man, and nobody even knows or suspects that the man is a Jew. This is the reason why whenever you take a first job, one of the most important things that you need to do when you take a new position and job someplace is right off the bat, they need to know you're a Christian and you go to church. That's not something to hide. That's not something to be ashamed of. And you ought not be working a job year after year after year after year, and then the secret comes out and people are shocked that you're a Christian. However, that's where Mordecai and Esther were living. Nobody knew. And Mordecai had raised Esther to keep it quiet. There are some things you don't talk about in public, and God is one of them. Esther and Mordecai were both compromisers. Verse number 12. Something else that God picked up a great big old scoop of, didn't like it at all. But God is putting together something very, very wonderful. He's making a miracle. He's going to save an entire nation of Jewish people. And He's doing it with these ingredients. Ingredient number 6 to help bring this thing about: unbridled lust. Verse 12, now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. Now here we find some of the details that were found in the king's harem and how they were kept. A young virgin was found in the village, taken from her home, and then placed in a 1-year program whereby she would be trained how to be the wife of this King Xerxes. And during that 1-year training program, she was taught how to fix her hair, how to walk, how to behave, how to eat, how to act like a lady at all times. And she was taught the most important thing of all, and that was how to please the king. This charm school lasted a full year. At the end of that program, each young woman was then scheduled for her one-night honeymoon with the king. The next day, she was then taken from the honeymoon suite, and she was put back into the girls' dormitory, and there she would live until the king chose to remember her and send for her. And that back then was how kings lived, and that back then was how lives were ruined. And by the way, this was the same system that Solomon saw from a distance, because that's how those other kings had their good times. And so let's incorporate that here. And because Solomon was the richest man in the world, he felt that he could also have the largest harem in the world as well. This is how he managed to accumulate 1,000 wives, many of whom he probably did not even know their names. Some of them he rarely ever saw. It was a pathetic custom. And obviously, God did not endorse it. And yet, because it was already in place, God chose to use it in order to accomplish His will. Verse 15. Ingredient number 7 was a king's heart. Verse 15, now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women. And she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. We recently covered this in our Sunday morning series on Proverbs, and it's a great and encouraging verse, because Proverbs 21 verse 1 says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will. And it was God who caused Xerxes, the king, to find Esther more attractive than any of the other women. And because of that, it was Esther who was chosen as Vashti's replacement as the new queen of Persia. But why was God interested in having Esther become the queen? It was not as a reward because of Esther's spirituality, because Esther was not spiritual. It was not so that she could have a nice change of clothes and an expensive wardrobe. It was not so that she could live in a fancy palace. It was not that she could have financial security for her future. It was not so that she could be happy and feel good about herself. God had a plan to rescue his people. And Esther was nothing more than a pawn that was on God's chessboard. And God was willing to use her even though at that moment she wasn't much. But why Esther? That one question raises an entirely new way of thinking that God's people need to get in on. The book of Job answers the question of why bad things happen to good people. But it's the book of Esther that answers the question of why does God bless people who are not so good? Because you know what? God does. And that sure should humble us. Because God has been so good to us when we have not been so good to him. And tonight I'm kind of throwing Esther under the bus, which is where she belongs, because this book is not about Esther. And this book is not about Mordecai. This book is about what God can do behind the scenes. He didn't have a whole lot to work with. And by the way, I don't know that he's too impressed with anybody in this building. Because I can assure you this, we have a whole lot more in common with Esther and Mordecai than we have with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Ingredient number 8, found in verse 18. Anytime you're cooking up something good, you got to have this. And that is salt. Verse 18, then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release, circle the word release here, and he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. The Bible tells us that God looks at his people as if they were salt. It's mentioned in Matthew 5 verse 13 where it says, ye are the salt of the earth. So what does that mean? Salt is used primarily for two things. One is it's a preservative. It will enable food to last longer without spoiling. But the second thing that salt is really good for is seasoning. It can take plain old cardboard tasting chips in a Mexican restaurant, and when you start shaking a bunch of salt on those chips, they come alive. What happens? Salt. Salt can make tasteless food taste really special. And that is exactly what you and I are supposed to do wherever God puts us. We're the salt. We're the seasoning. And if God happens to put us in a dead-end job with a bunch of losers, then our influence should cause that place to become better just because we're there. That's what salt does. It livens it up. It makes it taste better. And when God puts us in a place and we don't want to be there, God says, you know what? You're the salt. You're supposed to make this place better than what it was before you arrived. The word release that is mentioned as a result of choosing Esther. Many Bible scholars believe that that is a reference to the payment of taxes. And because Esther is the new queen, the king is announcing, okay, to celebrate the arrival of this wonderful lady, nobody has to pay their taxes for an entire year. You've been released from the debt and the burden of your taxes. Why would he do that? Because Esther, even though she was a compromiser, she was still a believer in Jehovah God. And as weak as her testimony was, she became salt as the new queen in that kingdom. And it was now getting better and better and better just because of her. Verse 19. Something else that God was going to use to bring about something very sweet and special. And that was missed opportunities. Verse 19, and when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai like as when she was brought up with him. Again, we find a reminder. We're told again, God wanting to emphasize the fact that nobody knows that Esther is a Jew. Nobody. We're told yet again that she had not breathed a word that she was Jewish. Her parents were dead. She'd been raised by her cousin Mordecai, who had become like a father to her. And while she was obligated to obey him as a child, she was no longer a child. Children are to obey their parents when they move out of the home. They're no longer under the rule or the leadership of mom and dad. They are then to honor their parents, but they're not obligated to obey them anymore. If that be the case, I would never have gotten out of the Navy. My dad was against it. He thought I was crazy to throw away a career in the Navy to be a Baptist preacher. Totally against it. Wasn't mean about it. It's just one of those father-son things that you just know, whoa, this did not go over too well. You cannot always obey, but you can always honor. Esther was of marrying age. And she was now going to marry a Gentile. Again, that which was forbidden by the Mosaic law. And how many times as an adult did she refuse to put her spiritual life in order, and yet she chose not to do so? She knew right from wrong. There were other Jews that were living around her. She saw how they were treated down at the market. She saw that there was a lot of people that didn't like Jews. But she kept her mouth shut. She enjoyed being thought of as a Persian. That's why she lived like a Persian. and looked like a Persian and dressed like a Persian and spoke like a Persian because she didn't want anybody to think that she was Jewish. She ate pork. She didn't observe the Sabbath. She was never referenced as having read the Scriptures. Over and over and over again, she refused to take a stand for God. Spiritually, she did nothing. And her life was filled with so many missed opportunities. And God looked at those opportunities that she had thrown away, and she said, you know what? God said, I think that I can use those too. Verse 21, the last thing this evening is this. Ingredient number 10, good deeds. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name, giving credit to Mordecai. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore, they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. When a plot was discovered to assassinate King Xerxes, Mordecai quickly told Esther so that she could warn the king, which she did. The conspirators were arrested. They were hung. The deed was recorded in the official journal, giving credit to Mordecai. And what did Mordecai get? Nothing. He saved the king's life, and he got nothing. Now, to a lot of people, that seems very unfair. But here we find a great lesson, and that lesson is this: no good deed will ever go unrewarded. Oh, it might take time, as it did in Mordecai's case. In fact, it might take even longer. But every good deed that we do in private, only God can see it. Every good deed will one day be rewarded. This thing called sowing and reaping, folks, it's real. And God is wanting us to understand, when you sow a good deed, you did this as led by the Holy Spirit, it'll come back to you with icing on top. No good deed will ever go unrewarded in the life of a Christian. Let's bow for prayer. Father, we're asking for your blessings to be upon this chapter, upon this message, and upon these truths. Holy Spirit, I pray that you would encourage each and every person here this evening, because we have so many faults, we have so many shortcomings, and yet you're still willing to use us. And so we ask and pray that you would allow those faults to humble us and then encourage us, because if you were willing to use Esther and Mordecai, you're willing to use anybody in this building tonight. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed.